Hi everybody, welcome back to our run through of the main characters of Inspector Calls. I hope we're all coping okay with lockdown and we're staying safe and well. Thank you again for all the lovely comments yesterday and ideas and feedback that people have been given. Like I said, if there's anything that you'd like me to discuss in a bit more depth, then please just add some comments at the bottom or get in touch via Google Classroom or through email and I'll endeavour to put those in. My plan at the moment is to cover the characters first and then we're going to have a look at some essay responses, have a look at some actual paragraphing and looking at doing some feedback on that. But for today we're going to be having a look at the character of Gerald Croft, who is one of the interesting characters within Inspector Calls, as he's not part of that BIRLING family circle. He's an outsider, he's an interloper, he's someone who's there by invitation due to his engagement to Sheila. He's also an interesting parallel character, looking at him as someone who's developing into the capitalist world, heading towards being a character like Mr. Berlin, and also a character who's slightly more mature and slightly more sophisticated than Eric. So he is that sort of halfway house character. Once again, we've got some key vocabulary that I'd like you to have a look at. With Gerald, a lot of this vocabulary can be used two ways. The part where he's being interrogated and feels remorseful and feels more guilty for what he's done, but then also a reflection towards the end about how he goes his character is cyclical and returns back to his capitalist viewpoints. Over the last two videos we've looked at two characters who react very differently to the information of Eva Smith's suicide. We have Mr. Berlin, who doesn't respond particularly well and ends up actually exonerating himself from a lot of the blame and a lot of the responsibility. Whereas yesterday, when we looked at the second character in Sheila, we see someone who accepts responsibility, someone who understands the consequences of what they have done. One way of approaching the character of Gerald is to see him as a halfway house between these 2 points of view. Gerald is someone who recognises the wrong that he's done to Eva Smith. However, at the same time, he tries to justify his actions and ultimately he tries to sweep under the carpet his behaviours and tries to exonerate his own behaviour. With the character Gerald, Priestley is making several points that we can link to context. First of all, we've got to consider Gerald as part of that patriarchal society that we were discussing with Sheila yesterday, a society dominated by men and Gerald's role within that. Priestley is using Gerald's character to show the effects of a society that is dominated by men and who do not take responsibility for their actions. Likewise, we have issues with capitalism and how people are going to respond to this. Gerald, as the son of Lord Croft, and how he behaves in a business manner will be important for us to consider. We can also have a look at the idea of youth and the idea of Priestley's message. We have Sheila yesterday, who responds to the message that the inspector gives her and reacts to this and makes changes to her life. Whereas with Gerald, we have a young character who has the information, the same information that Sheila has, and yet chooses not to act upon that. So contextually, there is a lot of things going on with Gerald around the ideas of sexism, around the ideas of patriarchy, around the ideas of social class. Within the stage directions, Gerald is described as a well-bred young man about town. And this is an interesting way for Priestley to create an impression for this character. We can infer from this that Gerald is someone who is socially active, someone who is respected, someone who other men in the town will look up to. However, it can be argued that Priestley's using some quite euphemistic language here. So if we talk about someone being well known and someone about town, if we link this to Gerald's confession later on in the play and his behaviour in the Palace Bar, it's implied that Gerald's behaviour around town might not be the most morally good. This is further reflected in Mr. Birling's relationship with Gerald. He describes Gerald as the sort of son that I always wanted, which first of all is potentially crushing to someone like Eric. However, it shows that relationship between Birling and Gerald and the way that they behave. The first sequence that we see Gerald, Mr. Birling has his cigar and Gerald has his cigarette. Gerald could be seen to be evolving into the character like Mr. Birling and being respected in this capitalist world and becoming one of the characters in the Palace Bar, like Alderman Megati, a well-bred man about town. One important direction we might want to explore with Gerald is his relationship with women and how he respects or disrespects women through his actions. At the very start of the play, in the engagement party, Sheila describes the engagement ring as the one you wanted me to have, showing that even in their relationship and the engagement, Gerald is trying to assume and assert control over her. Again, linking back to what we were just talking about with patriarchal society. When he's been interrogated with the inspector, obviously we have lots of information about his relationship with Eva Smith, or as he knows her, Daisy Renton. When the inspector starts to interrogate, Gerald responds with, "I didn't feel about her as she felt about me." And then Sheila quickly retorts with, "Of course you didn't. You'd have been her wonderful fairy prince." Now, what Gerald's doing with his behaviour is he's creating almost a reliance from Daisy Renton on him. With Gerald, it comes from a good place. He felt sorry for her. And she said, when Daisy admits that she was desperately hungry, Gerald's emotive reaction to that is actually quite a positive thing. However, we can also look at Gerald's motivations. One of the first things he says was that she was pretty with big dark eyes, compared to the hard-eyed and dull-faced women that he usually sees at the Palace Bar. So there's sort of sexist values going on there. He's been immediately drawn to Daisy because of her looks. When the inspector's describing their affair, Gerald refers to it as inevitable, I suppose. The fact almost that he can't help himself. And again, linking to these consumerist ideas of someone who just takes what they want, no matter whether that would be property or a person in this case. Gerald could be seen to be a little bit hypocritical. When Sheila wants to stay and listen to his interrogation, he says it's bound to be unpleasant, and the inspector retorts with, "And you think women should be protected from unpleasant things?" Gerald replies, "If at all possible," and yet he has done this unpleasant and immoral thing to Daisy Renton. So overall, with Gerald's relationship with women, it's a bit of a mixed bag. We have some positive aspects of his personality where he's empathetic and he's caring, considerate. However, he's also very controlling and can be considered quite manipulative in the way he behaves. Another aspect we might want to consider with Gerald is his very British reaction to devastating news, what we would describe as potentially a stiff upper lip. When he first hears about Daisy's suicide, it doesn't seem to register with him what actually happened until to come towards the end of his interview. He says, "My God, I've suddenly just taken it in. I've just realised that she's dead." This is demonstrating a sort of a lack of emotional depth with Gerald, potentially, that he can't respond immediately with his emotive response. Likewise, when he excuses himself from dinner and excuses himself from the party, he says he is rather more upset than he might appear to be. Now, at the time, one of the key values of society was to hide your emotions away, to be resolute, to not demonstrate these emotive and passionate outbursts. So certainly from a male perspective. So for Gerald to do this is actually suggesting that he's repressing his emotions, but obviously he's been affected a lot more emotionally than he's letting on. By the end of the play, Gerald becomes something of a problematic character, having excused himself to go for a walk and reflect upon his actions with Daisy and his realisation of her suicide. Gerald encounters a policeman who he inquires about an Inspector Gould. When he comes to the realisation that Inspector Gould is not a police inspector, he then uses this information to try and exonerate his behaviour, to try and say that, well, perhaps what we've done is not as problematic as it might appear. When he returns to the Birling household, his phrase, "we've been had," immediately sort of de-escalates the seriousness of the situation. He starts to see it as a prank rather than the reality of what may have happened. He's described as very clever by Mr. and Mrs. Birling for having worked it out. He doesn't seem to have reflected on his own behaviour. He even implies that it might have been several different girls, as if the fact that the consequence of the suicide is the most important thing rather than the behaviours which led up to that point. The sort of key exchange that we have with this is where Gerald reoffers the ring to Sheila. What about this ring, Sheila? The symbolic nature of that ring, with it being a circle, could also infer that Gerald has gone full circle. He's gone back to the behaviours that he was exhibiting at the start of the play. He hasn't changed, he hasn't learned anything, and he hasn't matured in the way that Sheila has done. And that's obviously reinforced by the fact that Sheila rejects this ring and decides, actually, we're not the same people who sat down at dinner this evening. As I alluded to a little bit earlier on, we can make some interesting stagecraft suggestions about the character of Gerald, about how he's presented to us as an audience. One of the key things with Gerald is at the start of the play his ease and his sort of comfort with alcohol. If we compare this to Eric, who's very nervous, even though he holds his glass with like a steady hand and he's very easy, finds making drinks very easy, Gerald seems to be comfortably at ease with alcohol, suggesting his development into these sort of alcoholic characters, the people he's criticising at the Palace Bar. If we look at things like the clothing choices for the character of Gerald, the men of the play are generally seen to be in black dinner suits, which could emphasise the sort of morally black nature of these characters and how the darkness is within them. Similarly, what we have with Mr. Birling and Gerald, we have this imitation aspect that I talked about at the start of the play, where Mr. Birling has a cigar and Gerald, as an imitator, is having his cigarette, and the fact that these characters are starting to blend into one another, that Gerald, as he matures, will become more like Mr. Birling, will become more like Alderman Megati. I hope that's been a useful, brief run through the character of Gerald, looking at some of those key ideas and those key characteristics there. For you to do, at the end of this video, there are 4 essay questions, as there have been for the previous 2. The first 2 very much looking at just the key ideas about the character. The second 2 where there is a little bit more debate, a little bit more thinking, a little bit more justification of your opinions involved within that. Like I say, my plan at the moment is to continue looking at the characters from Inspector Calls, and then in next week's set of videos we'll probably be looking at essay responses and looking at paragraphing, looking at how we can respond in more mature and sophisticated ways to set essay questions. We'll have a look at the mark scheme, we'll have a look at some exemplar responses and critique them as well. So I hope that's been useful, and if you stay tuned at the end, I've got today's film recommendation. For the film recommendation today, I've gone for something that's really, really close to my heart. I've gone for a film that I was not allowed to go and see at the cinema because it was deemed to be too scary. Something that I was obsessed with as a child, and something that, when I finally got the chance to see it, it's become one of my favourite films of all time, and that is Jurassic Park. It's an amazing film, a wonderful story, some really, really fantastic action sequences, some really, really iconic shots in there. The Tyrannosaurus Rex chasing the Jeep is one of my personal favourites, and the water glass with the ripples is just a fantastic shot. So that's today's film recommendation. Hope you enjoy. Hope everyone stays safe and keeping themselves busy during lockdown. Okay, see you soon.